Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something that's really become a central, a yardstick in the breakneck progress of generative AI leaderboards. We're specifically focusing on Chatbot Arena. It's this platform that has, rapidly become a hugely influential way for the media, the AI industry, even academic researchers to gauge the capabilities of these really advanced models.
Exactly. Yeah, since it popped up in 2023, Chatbot Arena has offered what, on the surface, looks like a very direct way to compare large language models.
Right.
Users submit prompts, the models respond, but anonymously, and then human evaluators rank which response they actually prefer. It's this user-driven thing that really filled a gap, I think.
Yeah.
Especially as, the traditional academic benchmarks started to feel a bit, less aligned with the open-ended abilities of these new AI systems.
Right. So instead of just standardized tests, you've got real-world user interactions kind of shaping the evaluation. But the big question we're digging into today, and this is sparked by a really insightful new paper, is whether putting quite so much faith in Chatbot Arena is giving us a truly reliable picture. Which AI models are really leading the pack, or if there are some, let's say, fundamental issues we need to understand.
And that's a critical question, isn't it? Because these leaderboards, they don't just satisfy our curiosity, they genuinely influence investment, research direction, even what end users expect from these models.
For sure.
The paper we're diving into, it's titled The Leaderboard Illusion, and it really takes a close look at some potentially significant problems with the arena.
Okay.
Drawing from their figure one, we'll be focusing on things like undisclosed private testing and how those results get reported, the really uneven access to the data that the arena itself generates, and some, frankly, opaque practices around when and why models are just sort of taken offline.
Right.
The paper basically argues that these things, taken together, could be creating a distorted view, maybe an illusion, of the true AI landscape.
Okay, let's get into this idea then, the leaderboard illusion. The paper's core argument, as I'm getting it, is that when a single leaderboard like Chatbot Arena becomes so important, it sets the stage for what they call gamification, which is that classic idea, Goodhart's law, when a measure becomes a target.
It stops being a good measure. Exactly.
So are we actually seeing AI developers maybe tailoring their efforts specifically to perform well on the arena's metrics, possibly, at the expense of broader, more fundamental progress?
That's precisely the worry. I mean, the authors suggest that certain practices by some of the major players, combined with what look like policies on Chatbot Arena that might maybe unintentionally favor them, could be incentivizing this kind of metric chasing. And maybe not always in a way that reflects real-world improvements for you, the person actually using the AI.
And this isn't just like a feeling they have, is it? The paper seems based on some pretty solid investigation.
Oh, absolutely. Their analysis is remarkably comprehensive. They looked at this massive data set, 2 million user-generated model comparisons or battles.
2 million, wow.
Involving 42 different AI providers, 243 distinct models, and this is over a 15-month period, roughly January 2024 to April 2025.
Okay.
And what's really insightful is they didn't just scrape the public arena data, they combined it with information from other sources to build a really detailed picture. They also did something clever. They categorized the models by license, proprietary, open weights, or fully open source.
Okay.
To see if there were any patterns, like who seemed to be benefiting most within this arena ecosystem.
All right, let's start unpacking some of these potential illusions then. The first one they flag is this issue around private testing and selective score reporting. What did they find there?
Well, this is really striking. The paper uncovers what seems to be an unpublicized policy. It apparently allowed a select group of major AI developers, they specifically highlight Meta, Google, and Amazon, to conduct extensive private testing.
Okay.
Like multiple versions of their models, run them through internal hoops, and then submit only the one that performed best internally before making it public on the arena.
So they could test a bunch and only show the winner.
Exactly. Figure 6 in the paper really lays this out. For instance, their data suggests Meta had, get this, 27 different private model variants under testing leading up to the release of Llama 4.
27?
Yeah. And Google apparently had 10 before launching Gemma 3. Now, contrast that with smaller outfits like the startup Reka. They seem to have just one active private version.
That's a huge difference.
It is. Cohere, it's worth mentioning, also used private variants, but the paper notes this was actually part of their own research into the effects of private testing itself. So a bit different.
Okay, but 27 private models for Meta. That's a massive behind-the-scenes operation just to get one model onto the leaderboard.
It really suggests that, yeah. And look, the rapid succession of top leaderboard spots being claimed by the big players, OpenAI, xAI, Google, in late 2024 and early 2025.
I remember that it was changing almost weekly.
Right. It strongly suggests this kind of simultaneous private testing was happening. The paper even mentions instances where the top spot flipped between Google and OpenAI twice in a single week.
Wow.
Given how long it usually takes to develop these massive models, it's just highly improbable they were making such huge leaps that fast in isolation, without tons of parallel experimentation.
Okay, so how does this best of N strategy, as they call it, how does that affect the actual trustworthiness of the rankings we see?
Right. Here's where it gets really significant for the stats side of things. The paper argues this practice fundamentally undermines a key assumption of the Bradley-Terry model, the BET model.
That's the ranking system they use.
That's the one. It's the statistical framework Chatbot Arena uses to calculate its rankings. Think of it like a system for predicting who wins in pairwise matchups, like chess ratings.
Okay.
A core assumption is that the comparisons are based on unbiased samples of performance. But if you selectively submit only your best result from, say, 27 private tests,
You're introducing a bias.
a massive positive bias into the data, yeah. Figures 7 and 8 in the paper use simulations to show how this best event approach systematically inflates the reported rankings. It makes it look like these providers' models are considerably better on average than they might actually be if you tested all the variants.
So it's not necessarily reflecting a sudden fundamental breakthrough in their core tech happening that week?
It might be more about strategic testing and submission on this specific benchmark, exactly. And here's a really revealing point. The paper found basically no evidence of academic research labs doing this kind of extensive multivariate private testing during the period they looked at, which raises a really important question, right? Was this practice widely known? Was it equally accessible to everyone playing in the arena? Seems unlikely.
That certainly paints a picture of an uneven playing field, doesn't it? Okay, the second major issue the paper brings up is data access asymmetries. What kinds of imbalances are we talking about here?
Well, this issue builds right on the private testing we just discussed, but it also folds in other key factors. The paper highlights how, yes, private testing, but also big differences in sampling rates.
Sampling rates, meaning how often a model gets shown.
Exactly. How often a particular model is shown to users for comparison. And also the practice of silently kind of retiring models, deprecating them. All these things contribute to really substantial disparities in who gets access to the incredibly valuable comparison data generated by Chatbot Arena.
And who does this disadvantage?
The imbalance seems to disproportionately hit providers of open weight and open source models. They often lack the resources for that massive private testing, right?
Yeah.
And they might rely more heavily on the public arena data for feedback and improvement.
Can you give us a sense of scale here? How big are these data access differences?
Yeah. Figure 4 in the paper is really stark. It shows that 4 companies, OpenAI, Google, Meta, and Anthropic, collectively control a staggering 62.8% of all the comparison data generated by the arena.
Over 60% for just 4 companies.
62.8%. Now get this.
Yeah.
That's 68 times more data than the combined share of the top academic and nonprofit research labs. We're talking Allen AI, Stanford, Princeton, UC Berkeley, all of them put together.
68 times more. Wow. That's a massive data advantage.
It gives those major commercial players a huge leg up, right?
Yeah.
In understanding user preferences, specifically within the arena context, and then fine-tuning their models to perform really well on this specific platform.
And you mentioned the number of private variants tested directly impacts this data access.
Very direct relationship. The paper actually includes their own internal experiment, showing that just testing a few more private variants can dramatically increase the amount of user feedback data you collect.
How much?
Well, in their test, when they went from testing 1 private variant to 3, their rate of data acquisition jumped from 5.9% to 19.4%.
That's more than triple the data just from adding 2 variants.
Exactly. So given that some providers were testing potentially dozens of private models, the sheer volume of preference data they were pulling in would be exponentially higher. Just way more information to learn from and tweak their models.
Okay, what about the differences in sampling rates you mentioned? How do they play into this?
Figure 5 in the paper illustrates this pretty clearly too. The maximum daily sampling rates they observed for models from OpenAI and Google were as high as 34%.
A third of the comparisons on some days?
Potentially, yeah. On the other hand, A provider like Allen AI, their max daily rate was only 3.3%.
That's a tenfold difference.
It's an order of magnitude difference, yeah. It means models from the bigger providers are just being shown to users way more often, leading to much faster accumulation of that valuable preference data. It's like getting way more at-bats to improve your score.
And the silent deprecation of models, that sounds kind of concerning for keeping things fair.
It is, yeah, it's pretty murky. The paper's analysis found that 205 models were silently deprecated. Meaning their sampling rate was basically dropped to zero without any public announcement or official flag. Now, compare that to only 47 models that Chatbot Arena officially marked as deprecated according to their own stated policy.
So way more were just quietly sidelined.
Seems so. And the stated policy itself is a bit tricky. It's based on a model getting over 3,000 votes and either having 2 newer models in the series available, or if more than 3 other providers offer cheaper or demonstrably better alternatives. But that word "or," combined with the fact that many models on the Arena are hosted for free, makes the policy really hard to independently check or audit. These silent deprecations, they further cut off the data flow for those models and their providers, maybe based on criteria that aren't clear to everyone.
Okay, one last point on data access. The paper mentions an API advantage. What's that about?
Yeah, this is another key factor that seems to favor the bigger, more established players. If a provider integrates their model testing directly with Chatbot Arena through their own API, their application programming interface, they automatically get access to 100% of the prompts that were submitted when their model was in a comparison. That's a goldmine of information about how users are actually interacting with their AI.
And the alternative.
In contrast, providers whose models are hosted by a third party, which is often the case for open weight and open source models, they're typically limited. They might only get public summary data, or they have to specifically ask Chatbot Arena for access to maybe only about 20% of the data related to their model's comparisons.
So a 5-fold difference in prompt data access just based on how you connect.
Potentially, yeah. It creates a significant informational advantage for those with that direct API integration.
Okay, so putting it all together, private testing, sampling rates, silent deprecation, API access, it seems like a confluence of factors creating a situation where a select few have this potentially unfair, significant advantage in getting the very data that drives the leaderboard scores.
That's the picture that the paper paints, yes.
So the next logical question then is, how much does having all this extra data actually impact a model's ability to climb the Arena rankings?
Right. Does it actually work?
Yeah.
And the paper provides some pretty compelling evidence suggesting that, yes, training models using data specifically from Chatbot Arena can significantly boost their ranking on the platform.
They tested this.
They did. Their own experimental results, shown in Figure 10, demonstrated that by increasing the proportion of Arena-generated training data, going from 0% up to 70% in a supervised fine-tuning process, the win rates on something called Arena Hard.
Yeah.
Arena Hard is a benchmark known to be highly correlated with Chatbot Arena performance itself. So, training on Arena data made the win rate on Arena Hard more than double.
Double the win rate just by using Arena data for training.
More than double, yeah. And the authors actually think this is likely a conservative estimate. They argue that those with private API access and more extensive private testing could potentially see even bigger gains from this kind of targeted training. It's a pretty clear sign that understanding and optimizing for the specific game of the Arena can lead to big ranking jumps.
That makes a lot of sense intuitively. If you know exactly how you're being graded, you can study for the test, so to speak.
Exactly. Study for the test.
But the paper also mentions things like distribution shifts in prompts and prompt redundancy. How do those fit in?
Right. These are really important parts of that studying for the test phenomenon on the Arena. Figure 11 in the paper shows how the language distribution of prompts submitted to Chatbot Arena has actually changed noticeably over time. Non-English prompts became significantly more common.
Okay, so the test itself changes.
The test evolves. And that kind of shift can advantage models that have been trained or fine-tuned on more recent Arena data that reflects this new distribution. And then there's Figure 12, which reveals a surprisingly high level of prompt duplication.
People asking the same questions over and over.
Both within the same month and even across different months, yeah. So having access to recent prompt data, especially if you're getting high sampling rates, gives you a competitive edge because you can effectively anticipate the kinds of prompts your models will likely face.
Because you've seen them before.
You've seen them, or very similar ones. You can then optimize your models to nail those specific, maybe even repeated questions.
It sounds like the data from Chatbot Arena, while useful for comparing models within that specific environment, might also be quite unique to the platform itself, not necessarily representative of everything.
That's a really crucial insight the paper raises. They point out that Chatbot Arena has certain built-in characteristics, like there's a limit on how long the responses can be, the context length. And the user base probably skews towards AI developers, researchers, enthusiasts.
Right, not necessarily the average person using it for, say, commercial applications.
Exactly. So this could lead to an overrepresentation of certain kinds of queries, maybe more technical questions, coding challenges, specific types of creative writing prompts, things that might not reflect the full, broad range of real-world uses for these AI models.
They give an example.
Yeah, they give this illustrative example. They noted that one released data set of Arena interactions had tons of Star Trek questions.
Okay.
But apparently zero prompts referencing classic literature, like, say, Chaucer.
Huh. So very specific user interests reflected in the data.
Potentially, yeah. And this unique nature of the data further incentivizes providers to optimize specifically for the Arena's particular flavor, its nuances.
Okay, so we've covered how private testing and these data access asymmetries can potentially skew the rankings. Now, the paper goes deeper into the reliability of the Arena rankings themselves, specifically looking at violations of the underlying assumptions of that Bradley-Terry model. Can you break that down for us? What are the assumptions and how are they being compromised?
Right. So the Bradley-Terry model, the BT model, as we said, it works by comparing pairs of models to estimate this underlying skill or user preference for each one.
Yeah.
For the rankings it produces to be truly reliable, several key assumptions need to hold up.
Like what?
Well, like unbiased sampling of the comparisons, which we've already seen, is potentially an issue with the best of N thing.
Right.
Also, transitivity of preferences. That basically means if users generally prefer model A over B and B over C, then they should generally prefer A over C.
Makes sense.
And third, a fully interconnected comparison network. That means every model should ideally be linked to every other model, either directly through head-to-head comparisons or indirectly through common opponents.
Okay. And the paper argues that the way Chatbot Arena operates, especially how it changes over time, puts a strain on some of these, particularly transitivity.
Exactly. The assumption of transitivity kind of relies on the idea that the evaluation conditions, the types of questions people are asking, remain relatively stable.
But you just said they change.
They do change. As we discussed, the types of prompts, the tasks people use the Arena for, they shift over time as the platform evolves and user interests change. Figure 14 in the paper uses a simulation that really illustrates this.
How so?
It shows a scenario with two phases, an early phase with one type of prompt distribution and a later phase with a different one. And crucially, some models get deprecated, meaning they stop being evaluated under the new conditions.
Okay.
The simulation shows that the rankings can become unreliable. A model that did great on the old tasks might keep a high rank based purely on its past performance, even if it wouldn't do nearly as well on the current prompts that the newer models are being judged on.
So you can't reliably compare a model ranked highly 6 months ago with one ranked highly today because the test changed.
That's the issue. This lack of continuous valuation under the evolving conditions really undermines the reliability of comparing rankings across different time periods.
And this issue of models being deprecated, taken off the Arena, that also hits the other assumption, the fully interconnected network one.
Precisely. The high rate of model deprecation, especially those silent deprecations we talked about, can lead to what's called a sparse comparison matrix.
Okay.
Imagine it like a social network graph. The models are the people, nodes, and a comparison is a connection, an edge between them. If you suddenly remove lots of people from the network,
It's isolated groups.
you can get disconnected graphs, yeah. Where some models haven't been compared, directly or indirectly, to other models that are still active. Figure 15 in the paper simulates this too. It demonstrates how this sparsity can cause the rankings generated by the BT model to diverge, potentially quite significantly, from the true underlying performance relationships.
So the ranking becomes less meaningful because not everything has been compared fairly.
If the comparison network isn't sufficiently well connected, the BT model simply can't reliably estimate the relative strengths of all the models in the ecosystem anymore.
So the very act of taking models off the leaderboard, especially if it's not done transparently or consistently, can actually erode the reliability of the rankings for the models that are left.
That's the argument, yeah.
Okay. Wow. So given all these potential problems the paper has surfaced, they must offer some solutions, right? Some recommendations for how to fix this, or at least improve the integrity of Chatbot Arena.
They absolutely do. The authors propose 5 key recommendations they believe are pretty crucial for restoring fairness, transparency, and ultimately trust in Chatbot Arena as a reliable benchmark.
All right, what's the first one?
Their first big recommendation is to implement a strict policy prohibiting the retraction of evaluation scores once a model has been submitted.
No takebacks.
No takebacks. They argue all evaluation results, including any scores from private testing of different variants, should be permanently and publicly disclosed. And on top of that, providers should have to declare the total number of private versions they tested before submitting their final one.
Full transparency on the testing process.
Exactly. They basically say there's no sound scientific reason to allow selective reporting. It just inherently introduces bias.
That seems pretty fundamental for honest reporting. What's next?
Second, they recommend establishing clear and strictly enforced limits on the number of private variants a provider can test for any single model launch aimed at the arena.
Putting a cap on that best of N strategy.
Precisely. It's aimed at curbing that strategy we discussed and helping to level the playing field between providers with vastly different resources. Their third recommendation focuses on getting truly fair sampling of model comparisons. They suggest going back to an active sampling method, something that Chatbot Arena organizers themselves had apparently initially proposed. This approach would actively prioritize comparisons between models that haven't been evaluated much yet, and also pairs where the outcome is uncertain, high variance, rather than just constantly showing the models from the biggest providers who already have tons of data.
So focus the comparisons where they're most needed for a reliable ranking.
Exactly. This would directly tackle those data access asymmetries we talked about earlier.
Okay, those all sound like really logical steps towards a more equitable process. What are the last 2 recommendations?
Fourth, the authors call for a transparent and auditable policy for model retirement, for deprecation. They suggest maybe a stratified approach, meaning you look within each license category, proprietary, open weight, open source, and maybe retire the bottom 30th percentile within each category, but only after the rankings have stabilized reasonably well.
So it's fair across different types of models?
Right. It helps prevent bias against certain types of models and also helps keep that comparison graph more interconnected over time. And finally, their fifth recommendation is about improving the auditing of model identities. Basically, making sure private models under testing are accurately tracked and attributed to their providers.
Better bookkeeping, essentially.
Better bookkeeping for accountability, yeah. To prevent any potential gaming of the testing process itself.
Okay. These all sound like very concrete, actionable steps that, could really significantly improve the trustworthiness and the overall utility of Chatbot Arena. So, to sort of bring our discussion to a close here, what would you say are the most critical takeaways from this deep dive into the Leaderboard Illusion and its findings?
Look, I think the paper provides a really important, maybe even necessary perspective. It highlights that while Chatbot Arena started with, genuinely admirable intentions, and it's undoubtedly been a valuable resource for the AI community, there are significant, potentially systemic issues now that affect its current reliability as a truly definitive measure of AI progress. These undisclosed policies around private testing, the huge disparities in data access, the non-transparent ways models disappear, it all adds up to a situation where the leaderboard might be, susceptible to gamification.
Right.
And the resulting rankings might not accurately reflect the true, complete landscape of AI capabilities.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that could misguide our understanding of where the field is genuinely heading.
It really just underscores how challenging it is, doesn't it, to create evaluation frameworks that are fair and transparent in a field that's just moving at such breakneck speed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the authors, to be clear, they are careful to acknowledge the hard work and the dedication of the Chatbot Arena organizers. They're not just criticizing, but they also make a pretty compelling case for the urgent need to really consider and implement changes like the ones they propose, to restore scientific rigor and maintain trust in the platform as a meaningful benchmark going forward.
Definitely food for thought. So, as you, the listener, are considering all of this, it kind of prompts a wider question, doesn't it? How might these findings about potential leaderboard illusions in AI evaluation resonate in other areas, other domains where we rely heavily on rankings and metrics to measure progress, to influence big decisions? What are some of the potential hidden biases or maybe unintended consequences we might be overlooking in those areas as well? It's certainly something worth contemplating. Thanks for joining me for this really insightful deep dive.
My pleasure.